This video is about the rise and fall of German emperors through war. Subscribe for more. The cool morning air of early 20th century Berlin was thick with anticipation. Kaiser Wilhelm II stared out from the ornate windows of a news palais, his mind racing with thoughts of power, empire, and the impending conflict that would shift the very foundations of Europe. The sun cast a golden hue over the city, but within the heart of the rise, shadows loomed, shadows of alliances forged in secrecy, and of nations poised to clash. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, President Woodrow Wilson grappled with a growing restlessness among his people. The whispers of war were becoming shouts, the kind that could not be ignored. America stood on the brink between remaining a neutral haven and plunging into the chaos engulfing Europe. Europe was a powder keg. In Germany, the fervor of nationalism and militarism was at an all-time high. Wilhelm's ambitions for a German empire seemed to echo through the very walls of the palace. Unbeknownst to him, forces were gathering both in Europe and abroad that would soon test everything he believed he could control. Back in Berlin, Count von Moltke, the chief of the general staff, meticulously plotted strategies in a dimly lit war room surrounded by maps and flickering candlelight. The sound of his quill scratching against paper was punctuated by the hushed murmurs of his aides. They analyzed the complex tapestry of alliances and enmities that defined the continent. Austria-Hungary, a fragile ally, sought to expand its influence, while Russia's ambitions in the Balkans threatened to ignite the entire region. Moltke's mind raced with scenarios. How could Germany solidify its dominance, but also stave off disaster? As tensions rose, the young officers around him gripped their rifles tighter, aware that their fates were entwined with the decisions made in this very room. Meanwhile, in the shadow of the Reichstag, a different kind of conflict brewed among the growing voices of dissent. The Social Democrats and the pacifists began to rise in opposition to the militaristic fervor. Clara Zetkin, a prominent figure among the dissenters, passionately argued for peace, rallying the disenfranchised workers to take a stand. A call to arms was not for guns, but for justice, a fight against a war that would consume the lives of countless innocents. Clara's voice rang out through the smoky taverns and streets, igniting a fire in the hearts of many who believed that Germany's future lay not in conquest, but in unity. On the other side of the world, a young Jewish soldier named David Ben-Gurion was just beginning to understand that the tides of war would not only reshape Europe but his homeland as well. Born in what was then the Ottoman Empire, David had been raised among the stories of his forefathers, tales of wandering and struggle. As the war unfolded, the whispers of Zionism grew louder, and the hope for a Jewish homeland began to take shape. He was determined to fight for his people's right to exist, even as the shadow of the war loomed over them. His fate would soon intertwine with those of empires, as alliances formed and shattered, reshaping the very landscape of Europe and the Middle East. As the summer of 1914 approached, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand shook the world. The young heir's death in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction of events that no one, neither Wilhelm nor Wilson, could have anticipated. The world plunged into chaos, the drums of war drowning out the cries for peace. Nations that had once stood united were now divided by blood and iron. Old friends became enemies, and old wounds were reopened. In the grand halls of the Kaiser's palace, Wilhelm's resolve hardened. He believed in the might of his empire. "We shall show the world that Germany is a force to be reckoned with," he declared, full with a mix of arrogance and desperation. The war machines began to turn, gears grinding against the backdrop of an impending storm. Soldiers trained for glory, fueled by propaganda that ignited their spirits. The skies were alight with the promise of valor, but beneath the surface lay the grim reality of war, trenches, bloodshed, and loss. As Germany mobilized its forces, the implications of this conflict rippled across the ocean. Wilson, torn between his desire for peace and the national interests of the United States, found himself in a precarious position. The sinking of the Lusitania, a British ocean liner, sent shockwaves through American society. The loss of American lives made neutrality increasingly untenable, yet Wilson hesitated. He pondered the heavy toll a war would take on his nation. Would America, the land of the free, abandon its principles to join an imperial struggle? In the midst of this turmoil, Clara continued to rally the masses, her growing influence a thorn in the side of the empire. She stood before crowds, urging them to think beyond the call to arms. "This war is not ours. We must stand together against a tide that seeks to drown us all." Her words ignited a fierce debate within the hearts of Germans, who were torn between loyalty to their Kaiser and a burgeoning desire for peace. As the months dragged on, the war began to take shape, an unimaginable scale of combat with millions of lives at stake. The battles of the Western and Eastern fronts became blood-soaked legends, with cities reduced to rubble and landscapes forever altered. With each clash, heroes were born and legends forged, yet the cost was staggering. The narrative of the Great War was being written in the blood of soldiers who fought valiantly for ideals they scarcely understood. In the chaos of the trenches, young David Ben-Gurion grew into a man hardened by the brutality of conflict. He witnessed the devastation of war, yet he also saw the resilience of his people yearning for homeland. The clash of empires had unleashed a wave of nationalism that could not be contained. Amidst the horrors of combat, alliances formed, Jewish soldiers serving alongside British forces, united by a common goal. The idea of a Jewish nation began to crystallize amid the fog of war, and David felt the weight of history upon his shoulders. As the war raged on, the question loomed larger. Could Germany maintain its grip on power as the world around it fractured? Could the Kaiser's ambitions withstand the push for democracy rising from within? And as America prepared to join the fray, what consequences would that have for the balance of power across the globe? As the echoes of artillery reverberated through the shattered landscapes of Europe, old empires crumbled and new nations began to emerge. The war would not only reshape the map, but would forge identities that would last through generations. The stakes were higher than ever, and the conflict was far from over. In the shadows of the Reichstag, Clara resolved to fight for a new Germany, one grounded in peace and unity rather than conquest and division. Across the Atlantic, Woodrow Wilson prepared to make the fateful decision that would lead America into the heart of war. And within the trenches, David Ben-Gurion envisioned a future for his people, a nation that would rise from the ashes of conflict. With the world on the brink, the rise and fall of empires were intertwined, bound by a cycle of ambition and bloodshed that only the strongest would survive. In the storm of war, destinies would clash, and the tale of power, sacrifice, and resilience had only just begun. As the first clash of empires reverberated across Europe, the fate of nations hung in the balance. The stage was set for conflict that would define history, and the question remained: who would rise from the ashes, and who would fall into oblivion? The answer lay just beyond the horizon, waiting to be unveiled in the unfolding saga of war. The summer of 1914 melted into a torrid autumn, and the Great War surged forward like a beast unleashed. In Berlin, the streets echoed with the chant of soldiers and the fervor of civilians who had swallowed the propaganda whole. Kaiser Wilhelm Roman II, wrapped in the glory of his imperial ambitions, watched as battalions of men, young and old, marched through the Brandenburg Gate. Their boots thudded against the cobblestones, a rhythmic promise of victory that masked the reality of death awaiting them. Meanwhile, within the confines of the General Staff, Count von Moltke pored over maps detailing the calculated movements of Germany's forces. The Schlieffen Plan, designed for a swift victory over France before turning east to confront Russia, was his chessboard, and every troop movement was a piece to be maneuvered. "We must strike hard and fast," he urged his officers, his voice firm as iron. "Every hour wasted is an hour towards our own demise. The world watches, and we cannot falter." As the plan solidified, Clara II faced a different battle. The city of Berlin had become her stage, where she spoke passionately against the war's madness. "Our young men are not pawns to be sacrificed on the chessboard of imperial greed," she thundered, her voice cutting through the din of 1,000 war cries. The hall was packed, a sea of faces reflecting her fervor. Some were inspired, others merely intrigued, yet her message resonated with a growing number of citizens weary of sacrifice. Yet, within this growing wave of dissent, a shift began. Men who once wore uniforms wore the symbols of peace instead, joining Clara's movement. They organized protests and leaflets, urging soldiers to refuse orders. Some called her the voice of reason, while others labeled her a traitor. But Clara was unyielding, rallying the populace to consider the long-term consequences of their blind nationalism. In the trenches of Flanders, the young men of Germany faced the grim realities of war. Among them was a soldier named Hans, barely 20, who had believed the propaganda but now faced the mud and blood of an endless battle. The echoes of cannon fire were relentless, punctuated by the cries of the wounded. Each day blurred into the next, a vicious cycle of dread and despair. Hans crouched low, peering over the lip of the trench, filled with a mix of fear and exhilaration. He murmured to his comrade, a man named Felix, who had lost brothers in the fighting. Felix's eyes glistened with unspoken rage and sorrow. "A war for glory," he scoffed, his voice barely above a whisper. Those days turned to weeks. The war expanded like a ripple in a pond, each nation pulled deeper into the conflict. The Allies rallied around Britain and France, while Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire forged their front. Enmity seeped into the very soil, fueling a fire of hatred that spread across borders. In America, President Wilson faced an increasing tide of pressure. The isolationist stance began to fray as news of atrocities reached the American shores. The Lusitania incident loomed large in the minds of the public and politicians alike. Wilson felt the weight of history pressing against him as he listened to his advisers argue passionately for intervention. One senator proclaimed during a heated debate. Wilson, torn between his principles and the growing clamor for action, turned introspective. His vision of a peaceful world, free from the shackles of imperialism, was at odds with the rising tide of patriotism engulfing his nation. Could America truly remain the land of the free while ignoring the plight of those he suffered in war? Back in Europe, as the war intensified, the Eastern Front lit up with conflict. Russian forces surged into East Prussia, and German soldiers were caught off guard. Among them was Hans, who now faced the harsh reality of combat with the Eastern enemy. The chaos of artillery fire and the cries of the wounded filled the air as he and his comrades fought to hold back the advancing Russians. Their sergeant barked, but as the battle raged, Hans felt the ground shift beneath him both literally and metaphorically. He witnessed the horror of war manifest before his eyes, comrades falling to the ground, their dreams snuffed out in an instant. Fear twisted within him as he began to question the very purpose of their fight, a sentiment shared by many around him. Meanwhile, Clara's voice grew louder amidst the tumult. Her determination took her beyond the streets of Berlin. She organized rallies in neighboring cities, fueled by the stories of soldiers returning home, shattered, traumatized by the slaughter. Each soldier brought home tales that contradicted the glory promised by the Kaiser. "This war is not for liberation, it is a destruction of our humanity," she exclaimed, her audience captivated by her conviction. The winds of change began to stir in the hearts of the people. Clara was becoming a beacon of hope for many, and her push for peace ignited a wave of support that crossed class lines. As opposition to the war grew, so did the government's scrutiny of her movements. But Clara pressed on, rallying the people not just to protest, but to envision a new Germany that would seek reconciliation instead of vengeance. As the war dragged into its second year, the front lines became entrenched both literally and ideologically. David Ben-Gurion, now a soldier in the British Army, stood on the precipice of his destiny. The promise of a Jewish homeland resounded in his heart, a distant echo of hope amidst the horrors of war. While he fought against the Central Powers, he witnessed the resilience of his people in the diaspora, their spirit ignited by the flames of conflict. In a small camp on the outskirts of Jerusalem, David gathered with other soldiers, sharing stories of their families and aspirations for a future beyond the war. "We cannot be silent," he told them. "A nation does not form by surrender, it forms through struggle and sacrifice." His words ignited a fire within the hearts of his comrades, many of whom looked to him as a leader harbinger of hope amidst the shadows of despair. As the war continued to draw blood from every nation involved, the political landscape shifted drastically. In Russia, the strain of war sparked a revolution, leading to the rise of the Bolsheviks. In Berlin, Clara's movement gained momentum, threatening to fracture the Kaiser's grip on power. Wilson, caught in the crosshairs of public opinion, began bolstering military preparedness, preparing for a confrontation that seemed inevitable. The world teetered on the brink as the fabric of empires began to unravel. The stakes were higher than ever, alliances trembled, and the ambition of leaders clashed with the fervor of the people. As the cries for justice rang out in the streets of Berlin, and soldiers like Hans grappled with the grotesque reality of war, the fate of nations hung in the balance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only decide the outcome of the war, but also reshape the very essence of the world as they knew it. Who would emerge victorious from the rubble? As Clara's voice rose against the tide of militarism, as David's vision for a homeland grew clearer, and as Wilson prepared to guide America into the fray, the question loomed, would the cycle of war ever cease, or was humanity destined to repeat its mistakes? The answer lay within the storm, ever closer, waiting to be unveiled in the following chapters of a history marked by ambition, sacrifice, and the undying hope for a future redeemed. The year 1916 dawned with a sense of grim realization settling heavily across the battle-scarred landscapes of Europe. The war had ground on for nearly 2 years, transforming the ideals of glory into a harrowing landscape of mud, blood, and heartbreak. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II remained resolute, but even the bravado of the Kaiser could not mask the growing discontent among his citizens. News from the fronts was disheartening, casualty lists grew longer, and the once heroic narratives of German victories began to fray. Count von Moltke, still the mastermind behind the military strategies, gazed grimly over the maps cluttered across his desk. The stalemate on the western front had turned into a bloody deadlock, with both sides entrenched in a war of attrition. He turned to his aides, frustration etched upon his brow. We must break these lines. If we do not act decisively, we risk losing everything we fought for. Meanwhile, the streets of Berlin were alive with the voices of dissent. Clara's Ekin had become more than a symbol, she was a movement. Crowds gathered in the city square, a figure illuminated by the flickering lights of makeshift torches. We are not fighting for a Kaiser, we are fighting for our future. She rallied, her voice a clarion call amid chants for peace. We must end this madness before it consumes us all. Among those listening was Hans, now a soldier weary of the unending violence. He had returned home on leave, his uniform tattered and his spirit diminished. As he stood in the throng, Clara's words resonated deeply within him. He glanced at the faces around him, friends and neighbors, many of whom had lost loved ones to the war. The camaraderie and hope were palpable, yet the shadow of conflict loomed over them all. What future can we have if we continue down this path? He whispered to Felix, who stood beside him, eyes dark with fatigue and loss. Felix nodded, his face lined with grief. We have to make our voices heard. We must remind them that this war is not ours. Together, they joined the chant, a chorus of voices rising against the tide of militarism that swept through the nation. The crowd surged forward, each step echoing with defiance against the imperial regime. Across the ocean, President Wilson felt the weight of the world pressing against his shoulders. The reports from the front lines were increasingly alarming, and the horror of the war seeped into the public consciousness. Cried one congressman, his voice a clarion call for action. Wilson's heart wrestled with the essence of his vision, a world without war, yet each day pushed him closer to the precipice of intervention. He could no longer ignore the mounting pressure. The United States was on the cusp of joining a conflict that had already claimed millions of lives. As the year progressed, the war showed no signs of abating. Battles raged across the Western Front, with the Battle of Verdun epitomizing the war's brutality. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in mud-laden trenches, their spirits dangling by a thread. Hands thrust back into the chaos bore witness to the horrors unleashed before his eyes. The thunder of artillery fire merged with the screams of the wounded, a cacophony that drowned out any lingering notions of glory. We are not victors, we are victims of a senseless game, he murmured to himself as he loaded his rifle, the weight of the weapon feeling heavier than ever. The toll on the men was staggering. As they fought, they lost not only friends but their very humanity. Hans found himself questioning everything he once believed, the Kaiser, the war, the very notion of honor. In a moment of vulnerability, he turned to Felix, who shared his despair. Is there any end to this? Hans asked, his voice barely a whisper. Can we find peace beyond this madness? Felix met his gaze, eyes glistening. If we survive this, we must fight for that peace. We owe it to all those we've lost. Back in Berlin, Clara continued to mobilize the populace, drawing thousands into her fold. The rallies became a phenomenon, transcending class lines as workers, intellectuals, and even former soldiers rallied behind her vision for a new Germany. We demand an end to the conflict. A call for peace must echo from every corner of this country. She shouted, her passion igniting the crowd's spirit. Yet, as her influence grew, so did the government's scrutiny of her movement. The authorities deployed spies to infiltrate her gatherings, seeking to undermine the burgeoning resistance. In the midst of this turmoil, a new front opened in the war. America had finally taken the plunge. Wilson declared war on Germany in April 1917, igniting fervor among the American populace. The nation rallied behind the call, eager to support the Allies in their fight against tyranny. Yet, Wilson's vision for a peaceful post-war world loomed larger than mere victory. He spoke of a League of Nations, where diplomacy would replace conflict. But his ideals faced a daunting task ahead: to unify a war-torn world and bring an end to the cycle of violence. As American troops began to arrive in Europe, the impact was immediate. The introduction of fresh forces boosted the morale of the Allies, who had fought through exhaustion and despair. On the front lines, soldiers welcomed the new arrivals, eyes shining with hope. Hans, now hardened by the relentless violence, felt an unexpected thrill at the prospect of change. Maybe this is what we need, he muttered to Felix as they prepared for the next battle. A force to turn the tide. The tide indeed began to shift. As American troops charged into the fray, battles raged with renewed fury. The clash at Canton illustrated the potency of American forces. Young men, fresh and untainted by the war's horrors, fought with an intensity that both astonished and terrified the seasoned soldiers. However, the war's brutality had laid deep scars on those who had endured the conflict from the beginning. Hans watched as the new recruits were thrust into the maelstrom, hope and idealism colliding with the grim reality of warfare. Meanwhile, David Ben-Gurion remained steadfast in the British campaign, fighting not just against the Central Powers but for the dream of a Jewish homeland. The war had taken on a new dimension for him. It was not merely about survival, but about securing a future for his people. The whispers of Zionism surged among the soldiers, stirring a collective longing for a nation reborn from the ashes of conflict. "We fight for our place in history," he told his comrades, their spirits buoyed by his words. As the war dragged on and the scale of destruction widened, the dream of a lasting peace became a beacon for many. Clara, fueled by the stories of returning soldiers haunted by memories of war, intensified her campaign for peace. The German people were awakening to the realization that the path of conflict would only lead to the suffering. "We must remember," she urged in one of her speeches, "that a true victory cannot come at the cost of our humanity." Yet, as Clara's movement gained momentum, the government pushed back harder. Spies were deployed to undermine her rallies, and dissenters faced increasing repression. The tension between the government and the peace movement reached a boiling point, and Clara began to receive threats. But her resolve only deepened. "They can silence our voices, but they cannot silence our hearts," she declared defiantly at a rally, her spirit indomitable. As the war neared its climax, the stakes grew ever higher. The trenches echoed with the cries of men, and the leaders of nations plotted their next moves as they sought to navigate the treacherous waters of war and diplomacy. For Hans, Felix, David, and Clara, the world around them promised both destruction and the possibility of rebirth. Each struggled against the tide of history, their fates intertwined in a conflict that would ultimately redefine humanity's course. With winter approaching, the atmosphere thickened with tension, and the cries for peace grew louder. Fires of dissent sparked across Europe, and amidst the chaos, a vision for a new world began to take shape. Would the dreams of peace prevail over the clamor for war? And as the Great War huddled towards its inevitable conclusion, the question remained, could humanity learn from its past, or would it repeat the cycles of ambition and devastation? The answer lay just beyond the horizon, waiting to be unveiled in the final act of an unfolding saga marked by sacrifice, hope, and the undying quest for a future redeemed. The winter of 1917 settled over Europe like a shroud, cloaking the battlefields in a silence that belied the carnage that lay just beneath the surface. The Great War was reaching a fever pitch, and every nation involved felt the pressure building, the kettle on the brink of boiling over. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm Roman II remained steadfast, but the man who had once commanded the respect of his empire now faced whispers of dissent within the very halls of power. Count von Moltke, burdened by the weight of failure, met with military leaders to discuss the next phase of their strategy. "We've lost thousands, and yet our enemies grow bolder. The Allies rally together, and we must do the same." Moltke's voice resonated with urgency. He gestured to a map strewn with pushpins marking the positions of troops and resources. "We need a decisive offensive. We cannot wait for the Americans to sink our hopes." But as he spoke, the officers exchanged glances, some filled with uncertainty. The harsh realities of a protracted war had begun to chip away at their confidence. Morale was waning. Outside the palace, the streets of Berlin became a battleground of a different sort. Clara's S movement gained unprecedented traction, drawing thousands who yearned for an end to the violence. "Peace is not merely an ideal, it is our necessity," she proclaimed from a makeshift stage in the center of the city, her voice echoing through the cold air. "We must refuse to be pawns in this brutal game. Our power lies in unity, in our refusal to fight." Amidst the crowd, Hans stood resolute, his heart pounding in rhythm with Clara's words. He looked around at the faces of his fellow citizens, many of whom had worn uniforms just months before. "We are not soldiers, we are human beings," he yelled, igniting a wave of cheers from those nearby. Felix stood beside him, their shared conviction igniting a bond that spanned the horrors they had both witnessed. As the rally continued, a distant rumble of artillery echoed through the air, reminding them of the war raging at the front. It was a stark reminder that words did not alter the reality that soldiers like Hans still faced daily. Yet Clara's movement was transforming the narrative. Across the ocean, in America, President Wilson felt the momentum of war shifting beneath him. The country was mobilizing, and with each passing day, the call for intervention grew louder. Yet, Wilson was a man of ideals, torn between the desire to preserve peace and the necessity of action. He addressed Congress, his voice steady. "We are the vanguard of democracy, and we must act to ensure that the forces of tyranny do not prevail." With every speech and every session, the United States took strides toward becoming a major player on the world stage. Troops readied themselves, and supplies flowed toward Europe. Young men, full of vigor and determination, answered the call, fresh faces replacing those who had worn thin from the brutal grind of war. Back in Europe, as the war dragged into its third year, the reality of the battlefield was stark. Soldiers like Hans felt the weight of despair settling over them, day after day of trench warfare draining the spirit from their bodies. The Battle of Passchendaele became synonymous with suffering, mud swallowing men whole while they fought for mere yards of ground. Amidst this despair, David Ben-Gurion stood in the British camp, sharing his vision with his fellow soldiers. "We are not just fighting for our countries, we are fighting for our futures," he urged. "The dream of a Jewish homeland is alive in the hearts of our people. Together, we can transform this chaos into a foundation for something greater." His words stirred something deep within his comrades, igniting a flame of hope that cut through the darkness of war. They were not merely soldiers, they were part of a larger narrative, one that transcended borders and empires. As winter deepened, the first signs of unraveling surfaced within the German Empire. The populace grew restless, hunger pangs from rationing gnawed at their resolve, and the haunting tales of soldiers returning home shattered by the war's horrors began to circulate. Clar's movement sparked a fire of dissent that reached the ears of the Kaiser's government. "We demand an end to the war," the protesters shouted, their voices rising in a crescendo. Clara stood at the forefront, unyielding against the tide of oppression. "We will not be silenced. Our future depends on our courage to stand against tyranny." Meanwhile, in the trenches, Hans and Felix found themselves contemplating their choices as the latest offensive unfolded. The sound of gunfire was relentless, and every battle felt like a tide of fate shifting against them. Hans looked at Felix, their shared experiences weaving an unbreakable bond. "If we survive this, will we have the strength to fight for peace?" Felix nodded, his resolve matching Hans's. "We must not let our sacrifices be in vain. We owe it to our fallen brothers to honor their memory with a future where peace reigns." As they prepared for yet another assault, the weight of their understanding pulled together, forming a silent vow that transcended the chaos surrounding them. In late 1917, the tide began to shift dramatically. The entry of American forces into the war invigorated the Allied powers. The battles became more coordinated, and the Allies were no longer fighting alone. As Hans stood on the front lines, he felt a surge of energy fill the ranks. "Together, we can change the course of this war," he shouted, rallying his comrades. But amidst the fervor of renewed hope, Clar's movement faced fierce backlash. The Kaiser's government cracked down on dissent with an iron fist, arresting protest leaders and censoring media. Clara found herself under constant scrutiny, yet the fire within her was unquenchable. "They may silence our voices, but they cannot extinguish our spirit," she declared as the authorities closed in. As 1918 dawned, the war's endgame approached. The combined forces of the Allies began to overwhelm the Central Powers. In the trenches, Hans and Felix prepared for what could be their final battle, their hearts heavy with the weight of uncertainty. As they charged into the fray, the horizon ignited with explosions, and the cries of men filled the air. The memories of their lost comrades flooded back, urging them forward towards the possibility of victory and peace. The collapse of the German front came swiftly, a series of surrenders rippling throughout the ranks. The reality of defeat washed over them with a bitter taste. In the streets of Berlin, Clara and her followers finally found their voices echoed in the halls of power. "We stand for peace, we demand an end to this war." The rallying cries resonated deeply with the populace, and as the government faltered, the voice of the people surged to the forefront. Ultimately, the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. As the news spread, sounds of celebration erupted throughout the streets of Berlin. Citizens rejoiced. Yet in the corners of the city, the voices of dissent reminded them that the cost of war had been steep. Hans and Felix, weary yet resolute, returned home with a determination to honor the memory of those they had lost. They joined Clara in her vision for a new Germany, one that would rise from the ashes of war grounded in principles of peace and unity. In America, President Wilson stepped onto the world stage, advocating for a League of Nations that aimed to prevent future conflicts. The hope of a new world order hung in the air, filled with promise yet shattered by uncertainty. Meanwhile, David Ben-Gurion saw the end of the war as a crucial moment for his people. The tide of nationalism surged, and the dream for a Jewish homeland began to crystallize amid the ruins of conflict. As the dust settled over the battlefields of Europe, the legacies of the war began to unfold. The cycle of ambition and devastation had been marked indelibly in the pages of history, but from that chaos emerged a new narrative, a quest for humanity, a relentless pursuit for justice, and the enduring hope for peace. As nations tried to reconcile their past with the dreams of the future, one thing remained clear. From the ashes of war, a new chapter awaited to be written, one that would echo through the corridors of time, shaping the destinies of generations to come. The war had claimed so much, yet it had also ignited the spark of change that could ultimately lead humanity towards a better tomorrow.